Welcome to Session 1. Why is assessment so important? We're going to explore readings from chapters 1 and 2, as well as some information that is beyond your text readings will be presented and supported in this session. Things that you will need for this session will be the Reitzel and Kuder text. You'll want that nearby to reference. You'll need your online session outline, as well as internet access. This PowerPoint has been designed to take about an hour and a half. Now, don't worry, it's not all straight lecture for an hour and a half. There are many times, as you can tell in your outline, in which you are going to be asked to pause the PowerPoint, pause the viewing, and work on external internet-related research type activities. So hopefully, I'm going to keep you moving. But hopefully it'll be meaningful to you. That's the goal. All right, so let's first start off by thinking about what is reading. Now, in order to approach reading assessment and even think about literacy in a greater view, we have to first look at a definition of reading. The International Reading Association gives us a very basic definition, but a pretty easily understood definition. Reading can be defined as the meaningful interpretation of written language. Now, if you'll notice, this definition is really two-pronged. We have both the incorporation of written language as well as the meaningful interpretation thereof. So that requires that children understand that our language, English, which is an alphabetic language, is made up of symbols, and that there are sounds attached to those symbols. And when we put all those symbols together, that they make up a word that indeed has meaning attached to it. So it's not enough for a child to just be able to decode the symbols, but we want them ultimately to be able to gain meaning from the decoding of those symbols. Therefore, a very inclusive definition of reading allows for both decoding and comprehension to meet in the middle and sort of balance one another out, especially when we're thinking about the end goal of reading being meaning. Why read if you're not gaining any meaning? Now, in order to provide a framework for literacy instruction, there's a few research bases that we draw upon. So these not only serve as a basis for literacy instruction, but also for literacy assessment, particularly if we're thinking under the framework that assessment drives instruction. So we look at the National Reading Panel first. In 1998, Congress convened a panel of research experts to review research on how children learn to read. And there were 5 components of reading instruction, basic reading instruction, that came from that research review. The first one is phonemic awareness, the second phonics, the third fluency, the fourth vocabulary, and the fifth text comprehension. Now, those are going to serve as sort of a framework for this course. We're going to look at assessment and instruction for each of those 5 components, as well as you can see that your textbook lays that out really nicely. There's a chapter on each of those things, if not more than one chapter. Now, that covers sort of the academic and cognitive aspect of reading, but we also look at, when we think of literacy as incorporating both reading, writing, as well as speaking, listening, and viewing, we want to think about assessing and instructing for writing. And we think of construction, the actual mechanics of writing, as well as the process, the cognitive process in which children get what's in their mind onto paper. So we're going to assess each of those areas of the National Reading Panel, and I want you to be really clear on each of those 5 areas by the end of this course if you're not already, as well as to be able to give some ways in which you can assess each of those 5, as well as writing, and to feel comfortable assessing writing, particularly assessing it holistically. We also know that, yes, those 5 components from the National Reading Panel are important, but we also know that motivation, interest, and reader self-efficacy are indeed important factors in individuals' reading success. So we're also going to assess those areas. If assessment does indeed drive instruction, we want to assess all of those areas. So that's one of the goals of this course, is to be able to sample an assessment of each of those areas, as well as to look at them closer to find out what are some assessments that we could use. Now, in order to really approach assessment and find effective and efficient battery of tests, we need to understand reading development. Now, because this course is specific for elementary teachers, we're going to look mostly at this notion of learning to read, and then we're going to briefly touch on reading to learn. But to do that, we look to Jean Chall's stages of reading development. Jean Chall was a researcher at Harvard in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Her research had a significant impact on how we view reading development, as well as what is good reading instruction. And Jean Chall came up with 6 stages of reading development. The first stage, or stage 0, is called the pre-reading stage. And this is roughly around ages 6 months to 6 years. And throughout this stage, oral language is important. And it is the notion that children need to be, in order to support and foster oral language, children need great interaction with oral language so that they can play and learn. That's where reading to children comes into play, as well as having very meaningful conversations with children. Not only is oral language important, but children begin to also recognize letters and symbols. They start to realize that that funny little symbol or that funny little shape has a name, and that sometimes when we see symbols such as the McDonald's golden arches, that means lunch or something special, and we refer to that as environmental print. So those are really 2 hallmarks of stage 0, the pre-reading. And children also learn that there's language inside of books, and that there are stories or there's information to be learned about something or someone inside of books. Here we have Dennis the Menace, and clearly he's not quite developed his concepts of print, but he most certainly understands that a story is contained inside of a book, and he's reading to his friend all about Snow White and her dwarfs, Bambi, Peter Pan, and Pinocchio. Stage 2, Chall refers to as initial reading, and this is typically grades first grade and second grade, where children are learning to read. This is where students learn how sounds and spoken words relate to print. So it's that initial mapping of letter-sound correspondences. I know that the letter C can make 2 sounds. It can make a k or it can make a s, depending upon, obviously we know, depending upon the vowel that follows it. But children are learning how those letter sounds map onto one another, and they're beginning to consolidate them into words, typically beginning with consonant, vowel, consonant words and growing on to bigger words. They're also learning that some words don't play by the rules. We have high-frequency irregular words that are often found in children's books in grades 1 and 2. And they're learning to recognize those as wholes per se, as opposed to trying to sound them out. And we also know that because children are trying to consolidate their understanding of letter-sound correspondences, as well as decipher between what word is irregular and what word plays by the rules, that their listening comprehension is much more efficient than reading comprehension. So at this time, we're much more interested in how a child can retell a story to us, one that's read to them versus one that they are reading on their own, particularly in first grade, because we know that they're glued to print, so to speak, and they're relying on their decoding strategies. Now, a nice framework for this learning to read, within thinking of obviously Chall, but one that parses it out into individual parts, is the Seidel Cognitive Framework for Learning to Read. Seidel was an organization out of, in fact, I believe it's Southwest Research Organization, that came up with this nice framework of learning to read. It was sort of a step off of the National Reading Panel. Now, I want you to, if you notice on your session outline, I've asked you to draw the Seidel framework and to label the components. I'd like for you to go to this website. This is a great interactive website in which each component is broken down for you. So you notice at the very top is reading comprehension. As I said earlier, that's the whole goal of reading is to comprehend what you're reading and to have meaning attached to it. But that reading is parsed out into two areas, particularly with regard to learning to read. We have language comprehension as well as decoding. What's nice about this interactive framework is that you can move your cursor over and at the bottom get a nice quick definition of what language comprehension is. You can click it and get further information as well as assessment techniques and instructional activities, as well as it'll parse out some state standards for you. So this is a very helpful framework. What I'd like you to do is to be able to give a quick definition for each part. So to speak, draw your framework, label it, and a quick definition. As teachers of children learning to read, these are important things that you know so that when it comes time to assessing each one of them, you know what you're assessing and you know what that assessment data is telling you with regard to informing your instruction. So take some time now to do that. Moving on, the next stage is stage 2, or the confirmation in fluency in the learning to read sort of aspect of CHALS stages. This is typically grades 2 and 3, and this is where children are really consolidating that knowledge, their knowledge of letters and sounds, and they're being able to read them with more ease. Their reading is less labored than it was in stage 1, and they're beginning to read with greater fluency. In fluency, we think about word accuracy as well as reading at a reasonable rate and using prosody or intonation to help read fluently. And because of that reading fluency aspect, we start to see children begin to read on their own for pleasure. This is a very exciting time for children with regard to learning to read. Now in stage 3, the tables turn a bit. In K through 3, we typically see much more emphasis on those early reading skills. So if you look at the CETL framework, we see much more emphasis on the things that go into decoding as well as the things that go into developing language comprehension. But around grade 4, the tables turn and we start to see that students are encountering much more difficult text. They're starting to read bigger and longer chapter books with regard to the narrative. And we know now with the Common Core state assessments that, or state standards, that children are reading a lot of informational text, not only at grades 4, earlier than that, but particularly by grades 4 they need to be really ready to analyze and synthesize informational texts. So they're no longer learning how to read, and they're not necessarily getting instruction on learning how to read, but they're getting instruction on using their reading to learn. This is where students need a nice arsenal of comprehension strategies, and most certainly comprehension strategies are important in K through 3, but in K through 4 they need to be even more well developed and complex and flexible to meet the demanding needs of different types of text. Stage 4 is sort of a continuation of stage 3, where comprehension continues to deepen and develop, as well as students encounter more content text that is more complex, that requires different text structure understandings, as well as, once again, an arsenal of flexible strategies. In stage 5, the last stage, is construction and reconstruction, and it's this sort of college and beyond. This is where we are. Students construct meaning from what they read, and they are also able to reconstruct new knowledge from what they are reading. Now obviously this can happen much earlier on, but typically at the college level and beyond, we're not necessarily receiving a whole lot of direct instruction with regard to decoding and or comprehension. We're expected that those things are in place so that we can move beyond any sort of, so that we are fluently strategic readers. Now CHALS stages are obviously a framework for understanding reader development, and they can help us consider assessment. So can the CETL-A framework. Now these are not the only one, these are just two that I thought that I would share with you and show you, but they can help us think about assessment. Another obviously very important place to start thinking about assessment and the types of things that we need to assess at certain times are looking at our state standards. Your text talks about this is a beginning point, a map, so to speak, with regard to knowing what we're assessing, when we're assessing, and what types of assessment we need to consider. So in Louisiana, your state has adopted the Common Core State Standards, and here's a beginning place for that. You can obviously, I'm going to ask you on your lesson plans to refer back to what Common Core State Standards you're covering or you're addressing in your lesson plan. So be sure to get to know these if you don't already aren't already pushed in that way to get to know them. But be sure you know them, because they most certainly can help you understand what you need to assess when you need to assess it. Particularly if you're thinking about foundational skills, those are embedded within the reading standards, as well as reading informational text and reading narrative text as well. So get to know those state standards, or the Common Core State Standards. Now moving along, so we are thinking about reading development. We think about those standards and those benchmarks and those important starting places. But we also need to have principles that sort of guide our assessment thinking. And the first one that the authors of your text came up with is, the teacher's goal is to find out what children can do. Yes, we screen to see if children may be at risk for reading proficiency or at risk for a reading problem, but ultimately we also want to look at what children can do, because that sort of assessment and that framework for assessment can inform our instruction. So we know that if we look at what children can do and we know it's going to inform our instruction, then we're able to gather relevant assessment tools in advance. We can also use this assessment data from the assessment tools that we use to analyze students' results using if-then thinking. Later on in the PowerPoint, we're going to quickly visit if-then thinking, because I'm going to ask you to do quite a bit of if-then thinking. And if-then thinking can most certainly be informed by your state standards, as well as child's stages, as well as what you know about reading development. And of course, the last principle for assessment is documenting students' reading and of course spelling, writing, etc. growth over time. That's important, is being able to see how students are growing, and that assessments are not just static, but they are actually indeed giving us a great picture of how the student is doing. Now, there are 4 things that sort of I've come up, well, not really come up with, but I've sort of summarized from what I know about assessment and what research tells us about assessment, are 4 things to consider when choosing an assessment. The first thing is we need to have an assessment objective or a question, and obviously that's what do we want to find out our student can do. And we think about reading development, and we think about understanding state standards. So for instance, if we have kindergartners and we know that one of the foundational skills on the Common Core is phonological awareness, and we know that by the end of the kindergarten year that students need to demonstrate awareness of being able to recognize and produce rhyming words, count, pronounce, blend, and segment syllables in spoken words, blend and segment onsets and rhymes of single syllable spoken words, etc., etc., then I know that I need to find out what my student can do with regard to phonological and phonemic awareness. And I need to screen that at least 3 times a year to see if students are at risk for that and need more intentional instruction in phonemic awareness. So I need a nice assessment objective or assessment question. What do I want to see that my students can do? And then based on my assessment objective, I need to find out what type of test and for what purpose do I need. And we'll look at that more specifically here in a second. And then I need to look at the design of a test. Is it going to be criterion referenced or norm referenced? And when would I want to look at either? And then last of all, the unit of administration. So when we think about what a child can do and we're formulating an assessment objective, we essentially want to find out what's established, what's developing, and what's emerging with regard to a particular area or skill. So I want you to take some time right now and on your session outline, write down quickly, what do all of these terms mean? So come up with what I call an elevator definition. That is, if you and I stepped on an elevator on the first floor, you would have to define quickly what established means by the time we got to the 5th floor. And for me to walk away and understand that you know what established means. So come up with your elevator definitions for established, developing, and emerging. Take time to do that now. After we have our nice assessment objective or assessment research question, then we want to figure out what type of test do I need. And the type of test is going to depend on the purpose, obviously. There are 4 main types of tests that we're going to refer to, and I'm going to ask you on your assessment reports, what type of assessment is this, or what type of assessment could this be? And I'm going to be asking you to refer to whether or not this could be a screening measure, a diagnostic measure, a progress monitoring tool, or is it outcome reporting? So let's look at the first type, a screening measure. A screening measure is designed as a first step in identifying children who may be at high risk for delayed development or academic failure and in the need of further diagnostic testing for either more intentional reading instruction or special services. This is often called benchmarking, and this is typically done 3 to 4 times a year. In the school district that I taught in, it was done 3 times a year. September, January, and May. Now, that's dependent upon, obviously, how your school district works. But think about the screening measures that your school uses. The second type of test, a diagnosis or diagnostic test, is a test that helps teachers in instruction by providing more in-depth information about the student's skills and instructional needs. A screening measure may or may not give you any indication of what they need to work on next. It may just indicate that they may be at risk for something or at risk for reading difficulty. Diagnostic measures, on the other hand, pinpoint what it is. They help diagnose the problem, so to speak, and can inform your instruction and help you design effective and intentional intervention for the student. Now, when we've designed that effective and that intentional intervention, we then want to monitor the student's progress within that intervention, and that's where progress monitoring comes into play. Progress monitoring is determined through frequent measurement to see whether or not if students are making adequate progress or they need more intervention to achieve grade level outcomes. And frequent measurement is the key here. It's also the type of measurement that you use as well. But this dynamic assessment, which progress monitoring is also called, is done frequently, maybe weekly, bi-weekly, usually not less than that. But we track that and we graph it and we track it and we look to that progress monitoring data to help us make an informed decision about whether or not that student does indeed need more intervention or not. The last type of assessment is outcome reporting. And outcome reporting is what we typically think of when we think of high-stakes tests. This provides a bottom-line evaluation of the effectiveness of an overall sort of reading program in relation to performance levels. Outcome reporting is typically done it's normed often. So students are evaluated with regard to ranking or comparing their performance to other students their own age. So these are 4 types of assessments. Now what I want you to do next on your outline, your PowerPoint outline, is I want you to think about these 4 types of assessments, and I want you to come up with how your school does each of those. So with that said, scrolling down here to an overview of your school's assessments. If you know the screening measure that your school uses to measure, say, listening comprehension or phonemic awareness, type it in or write it in, as well as the diagnostic measure, any progress monitoring measures, and any outcome testing measures. Now, if you're not sure what your school uses, you can put not sure. That's fine. But that's something that you'll want to know and I want you to gain awareness, if you don't know, of what those measures are so that you can be very informed and aware of what's going on with regard to assessment, literacy assessment at your school. Now, when we consider type of test, there's also two buzzwords that you often hear. Formative versus summative assessments. Now, what I'd like you to do now is to go to this website here. This is a nice little assessment. It's called the Basics of Classroom Assessment. And here we have a definition of formative and summative assessments, as well as examples. And I want you to, if you already know the definition from previous experience, go ahead and define that first question. What is the difference between formative and summative? If you're not sure, go to this website, check out the difference between the two, and come up with a clear sort of response to that question. So you can pause the video and do that now. The last type of assessment that we are going to sort of discuss is the inclusion of observation as assessment. Now, observation is what some literacy researchers have referred to as kid watching. Kid watching can be anything from observing students' oral language interaction to observing them as they read and taking anecdotal notes. Reitzel and Kuder, the authors of your text, very much support the use of observation as one strand of assessment. In fact, they dedicate pages 26 through 32, I believe, through 33 actually, to give you some ideas of how to use observation in your classroom. And really what I want you to stop and think about is, what do you think about observation as one strand of assessment? Some people use the counter argument that observation isn't very reliable or valid. In certain contexts, I most certainly agree with that. But as a classroom teacher, I found observation to be quite helpful. Most certainly not the only assessment, but I did find it helpful. So what do you think? Do you think observation is a helpful tool? Do you think it's an important tool? And if so, how would you incorporate, or how do you already incorporate it? So thinking seriously about observation as assessment. In your assessment reports, I will ask you not only to include the data from your actual informal assessments, but also to include any observational data as well to help you get a clearer picture of your student. The next thing we consider is the design of the assessment. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, other than I'm going to differentiate, help you understand the difference between criterion and norm referenced assessments. And basically it's pretty simple. It's the way in which students are evaluated. A criterion reference, which is also known as something that's more content driven, evaluates student learning against a set of criteria. So, for example, going back to our kindergartners, and we're assessing phonological awareness, a criterion referenced assessment would look at, per se, if they're asking a student to recognize and produce 10 rhyming words, a criterion referenced exam would look to see how many out of that 10 they were able to get correct. And the evaluation would be based on that set of criteria. Whereas a norm referenced would evaluate that learning by judging and ranking that student's performance against the performance of their peers. So the outcome of that assessment would be a score that in which is reported using this normal bell-shaped curve. So you may get a percentile or a Z or T score or a Stanine in which the student's score is indeed ranked against the performance of his or her peers versus evaluated against a set of criteria. So that's really criterion and norm reference. We could go into, obviously, the statistical design of those norm-referenced assessments. But really, as a classroom teacher, you need to understand the difference between the two so that when you get those scores reported, you're able to analyze them and talk to parents about them in an accurate and informed way. Now, with all that said, when we think about tests, both criterion referenced as well as assessments that are norm referenced, we want to ask the important questions about reliability and validity. Now, this website, the same website that you looked at, formative and summative assessment, has information on reliability and validity, and it's really nicely set up. It's very simple, it's very clear, and I want you to go to that website again and answer those questions. What is reliability? What are the types of reliability, if that will help you answer what is reliability, as well as what is validity. And do the try this section down here. It's on your outline. Try to answer those questions to your best ability based on what you know about reliability and validity from prior knowledge as well as what you read here. I think that we'll briefly discuss reliability and validity the next time we meet. But I'd like you to take some time to look at that. So if you'll pause the video now and do that. All right, the very last thing that we consider with regard to choosing an assessment is thinking about the type of administration. Classroom time is valuable. I know, preaching to the choir there. So you want to think about if I'm doing a screening measure, is it possible to do a group measure? Or if I need to do something diagnostic for a student who is maybe at risk for reading problems in a certain area, I obviously need to do something more, administer something that is single student, so that's going to obviously take a little bit more time. So I need to think of the type of administration with regard to really classroom time management with regard to assessment. Now, earlier I had you all list assessments that are used in your classroom with regard to the four main types. And I'd like you to refer back to that list. And I'm going to show you a pretty cool database of reading assessments. Well, I think it's cool as reading assessments can be. That contains a plethora of information on various reading assessments. So let's visit that assessment really quick. All right. This is the CETL. If you remember the CETL-A framework, this is the CETL assessment database, and housed within this assessment database are hundreds of different reading and literacy related assessment tools. You can browse them, or you can compare their features on a summary chart. There's a lot of different things you can do. One of the greatest things about this is that you can look at assessment results depending upon, obviously if you see some of these are the components of the CETL-A framework, but you can choose. So you don't have to look at tons and tons of assessments. You can choose if you know you need to assess phoneme awareness and you're interested in both looking at norm and criterion referenced assessments for a kindergartner, and you know it needs to be in English. You can search that fairly quickly and come up with various reading assessments. The great thing about this is that it shows you how much it costs, the time it takes to administer, the administration type, if you remember, obviously the cognitive elements supported from the CETL-A framework, as well as what are the subsets and skills that are assessed. Look at all these things that are assessed. And gives me some notes, tells me it's a criterion referenced. There's no normative assessment data, so I know when I interpret the results, I'm not looking at how my student's performance compares to students of his or her own age. This is a great tool. You can also add it to your clipboard so that you can compare various different assessments. What I would like for you to do is on your session outline to use that assessment activity grid to look at the screening measure that your school uses and the components that are measured, the design of it, the unit of administration. I want you to be an informed consumer of that assessment. If you feel like you know that assessment really well, look up another possible screening measure or another measure that you feel would be appropriate for screening, diagnosis, or progress monitoring in given the grades that you teach and the school that you teach within. So please use this grid and either choose the assessments that your school has used or find new ones. But at least one assessment per box would be great. And do just really explore that website. Get to know it. It's a really underused tool. So take some time now, pause the video and do that. All right, so we have talked a ton about assessment. We've talked a ton about assessment jargon, four principles or 5 principles for assessment, as well as 4 things to consider when choosing an assessment. And we've looked at a nice assessment database to get an idea of what's out there, as well as a tool that you can use to help you find assessments. And so that leaves us to this bigger question, this bigger classroom question of how does assessment inform our instruction? Well, any of you that are familiar with Lev Vygotsky and the work of his sociocultural learning theory, you know that assessment can help inform and help us teach within a child's zone of proximal development, or basically that area that what a child can do in cooperation today, given explicit modeling and guided practice, he can do alone tomorrow with independent practice. So assessment not only helps us understand what the student can do, but can help us understand with regard to what's the next logical step. What do they need explicit instruction with? And we can sort of model our instruction after the gradual release of responsibility model. This is a graphic for the gradual release of responsibility model, where we move from teacher-centered to student-centered, and there is scaffolding, another Vygotsky term, along the way. Assessment comes into play up here. It helps us understand what the child can do, what they're ready for next, and what our explicit instruction is going to be. And then how do we move it from guided to collaborative to independent practice. And then we assess again here, and we move back upwards. So this structure for instruction can also help us with knowing what do we need to assess and what comes next. It's a very cyclical process, and if done well, can be extremely efficient and effective. Now, another piece for assessment that will help us is that assessment can help us with instructional grouping. We all know that our literacy block, our reading and writing blocks, are times in which we need to make sure that instructional time it's precious, and we need to make sure it's effective. So we know that grouping can be one way to help make it as effective and as efficient as possible. Assessment data can help us understand what all of our students can do and what they need, as well as what do small groups of my students need, and then further, what do individual students need. So assessment data can help answer each of those questions. And one way that your authors suggest in helping to create to answer these questions, as well as create flexible groups, is to create literacy profiles. Now, you can find a literacy profile for an entire class on page 36. That is clearly one example where the teacher has really thoughtfully thought about the skills that the student needs, that all of her students need, as well as how they relate to the state standards. And then she's used that terminology that we looked at earlier in the PowerPoint, this notion of being proficient, developing, and emergent, and she's used that to help her understand where her students fit with regard to these particular reading-related skills. Now that's a whole group literacy profile. Here's a literacy profile that my sister-in-law at her district in Texas created, and they have a literacy profile for each first grade student. Now they use DIBELS as well as DRA as a benchmarking or screening assessments. And so they keep a literacy profile with regard to just screening measures for every student. This can be a very efficient way to track students' grading progress. And obviously you could create another literacy profile for students who perhaps are at risk and need more intentional instruction, and you can track their progress and create a literacy profile for progress monitoring measures as well. So these are two examples of literacy profiles. But tracking that data and organizing that data and having a profile on each child can truly help you group. Now flexible grouping, as you see on page 39 in your text, different options for grouping instruction, is really important to understand that there are options out there and that some skills actually work better in heterogeneous groupings, whereas some skills work a little bit better in more homogeneous groupings. A great example of a heterogeneous group is research tells us that when students have difficulty with phonemic awareness, that they can actually benefit from more heterogeneous groups with regard to small group instruction for phonemic awareness. When students who struggle with phonemic awareness are in groups with children who are actually doing really well, they not only practice it themselves, but they also have opportunity to hear other children who are proficient with it practice it. So it becomes a reinforcement. So flexible grouping is really important to understand, and I most certainly think that assessment data can make flexible grouping happen, whereas otherwise you're just ability grouping and there's no movement in and out of it. Here's an example of an if-then chart, which can help you with regard to the student that you're going to be working with in this class, make assessment-driven decisions. So if we know what the child can do, then we think about what they're maybe having difficulty with. So if you look at that first row, if the child can't decode but knows letter sounds, then I know that decoding words involves multiple strategies. Onset rhyme is important, as well as looking for words within words. Structural analysis is important. Knowing the breakdown of different letter sound combinations as well as context clues can be important. So I know that those are important things, so I'm going to build my strategies from that. So I'm doing the if-then thinking. And then the last column, I'm looking at the area that we're working on. We're working on word identification based on what the child needs, what they do need to be doing, what strategies I can use, so that when it comes time for me to assess whether or not my instruction or my intervention is indeed working, that I'm assessing word identification. Oftentimes we can get caught up in using an assessment that may not be assessing the target skill that we're actually working on, and then we can have some skewed assessment results. So consider using this if-then chart for helping support literacy instruction for your student in this class. Next, we're almost done, but next I'd like for you to look at and to consider Chapter 2, what you read about response to intervention. You probably have already heard, you've probably been to professional developments on response to intervention, but I want you to think about your prior knowledge of RTI, your experiences with the RTI, as well as what you read in Chapter 2 to take time to answer the following questions. We're going to review these when we meet the next time. So think about, what is RTI? What are the 3 levels or tiers of support in RTI? What assessments take place or could take place at each level or tier, and why? Why do you do those certain assessments at that time? And then think about the advantages and disadvantages of RTI. Think about it not only from the teacher perspective, the student perspective, as well as an administrator school-wide perspective. So think about the advantages as well as possible disadvantages of RTI. So take time now to do that. Now, just to reiterate before we close this session, how will we use assessments in this class? We're going to use informal assessments to inform your instruction time with your student. You're going to use a battery of 6 assessments, 2 looking at interest and motivation and self-perception or self-efficacy of reading, as well as 2 to help understand reading. You'll look at the informal reading inventory, the 3-minute assessment, as well as a running record and miscue analysis. We look at spelling, the Words Their Way inventory, which is a popular word study program, as well as looking at a writing sample. Now there are other assessments that if you'd like to do and you're interested in doing it and you have the time to squeeze that into your sessions with your student, you're more than welcome to do so, but please let me know before you do them. This list has indeed been cut short in the interest of time, and I tried to keep them informal assessments that you could indeed use that are free, as well as assessments that are accessible in your text or in an article. So that concludes this session, and I hope that you've learned a few things about assessment. If not, it's reinforced some of the things that you know about assessments. So be sure to check Edmodo for the postings for this assessment, or I'm sorry, for this session, and don't forget to bring your online session outline to class the next week on February 4th. Please let me know if you have any questions with regard to this video.